For 7 years, the billionaire's son never made a sound. Not a cry when he was born, not a laugh on his birthday, not even a whisper when he tried. Every doctor said the same thing. There is nothing we can do. His father spent over $100 million, flew to Boston, to Los Angeles, to Rochester. Speech therapists, neurologists, specialists who charge more per hour than most people earn in a month. They all said the same words: permanent neurological muteness. Accept it. Then a maid noticed something in his throat, something dark, something everyone had missed, and what she pulled out would expose a lie that had lasted 7 years. What happened next? You need to see it for yourself. Before we continue, if you're the kind of person who stays to the end of stories like this, stories about truth, sacrifice, and things the world almost lets slip away, you should subscribe now. People who don't usually realize later they were part of the crowd that almost missed it. The Jackson mansion stretched across 12 acres of Connecticut coastline in Westport. From the road, it looked like something out of a magazine. White columns, windows that caught the sunrise, gardens manicured to perfection, iron gates that opened slowly, deliberately, like the house itself was deciding whether to let you in. But inside, silence. Not the peaceful kind. Not the kind that feels like rest after a long day. This silence was suffocating, heavy, like something was pressing down on your chest and wouldn't let go. Servants moved through the marble hallways without speaking. Their shoes barely made a sound against the floor. They'd learned quickly. Mr. Jackson liked things quiet. No music played in that house, no television noise, no children running and laughing the way children should. Just silence. And somewhere deep in that silence, a father was drowning. Thomas Jackson sat in his study most nights, staring at the portrait above the stone fireplace. There she was, Loretta, his wife, her smile captured forever in oil and canvas, her eyes still bright, still full of life that no longer existed. Next to her in the painting, a younger version of himself, looking whole, looking like a man who still believed the world made sense. And between them, Brian, only 2 years old in that portrait. Before Thomas understood that his son would never call his name. Loretta died at Greenwich Hospital, the day Brian was born. Complications, the doctors said, as if that word could explain why his wife bled out on a table while he stood helpless in a hallway. She'd tried to say something at the end. Her lips moved, but no sound came. Just like their son, Thomas never forgave himself. If he'd chosen a different hospital, if he'd demanded better doctors, if he'd been paying more attention instead of celebrating, maybe she'd still be here. Maybe Brian would be different. The guilt lived inside him like a second heartbeat, constant and unrelenting. So Thomas did the only thing he knew how to do. He spent money. Millions of dollars on the best specialists in the world. Private flights to Boston Children's Hospital, to Mayo Clinic in Rochester, to UCLA Medical Center. Hotel suites that cost more per night than most families earned in a year. Every doctor ran the same tests: MRIs, CT scans, genetic panels, neurological assessments, and every doctor delivered the same verdict: your son's muteness is congenital, neurological, permanent. There is nothing we can do. You need to accept this, Mr. Jackson. Accept it. How could any father accept that his child would live in silence forever? How could he accept that Brian would never hear his own voice, never say he was hungry or tired or scared? How could he accept that his son would never say, "I miss Mom too"? So Thomas kept searching, kept writing checks that would bankrupt small countries, kept hoping that somewhere in the world, someone had an answer. He didn't realize the answer wasn't in a research lab or a surgical suite. It was about to walk through his front door carrying nothing but a worn duffel bag and a prayer she'd whispered that morning. Her name was Sandra Wallace, and she was about to shatter everything Thomas thought he knew. Sandra Wallace arrived on a grey morning in late September, the kind of morning where the clouds hang low and heavy, making everything feel like it's holding its breath. She stood at the iron gates of the Jackson estate, her hands gripping the straps of her bag, trying to steady the fear rising in her chest. This was it, her last option. Back in Newark, New Jersey, her father was lying in a hospital bed at St. Michael's Medical Center. Dialysis, 3 times a week. The bills were stacked on her kitchen table like a tower that never stopped growing. 4 months behind, that's what the notice said. If she didn't pay soon, they'd stop his treatment. Transfer him somewhere else, somewhere cheaper, somewhere people went to die instead of heal. Sandra couldn't let that happen. Her father had raised her alone after her mother walked out when Sandra was 6. He'd worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table, prayed over her every night, taught her that faith wasn't just something you talked about on Sundays. That man deserved better than a cold room in a state facility where no one knew his name. So Sandra took this job, maid at a billionaire's mansion. She didn't care about the address or the wealthy family. She just needed the money to keep her father alive. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, met her at the door. Stern face, sharp eyes, the kind of woman who saw everything and smiled at nothing. "You're Sandra Wallace." "Yes, ma'am. You'll clean the east wing, the main hall, and the library. You'll keep to yourself." "Mr. Jackson doesn't like disruptions, especially around his son." Sandra nodded. "I understand. Do you?" Because the last girl didn't understand. She tried to get friendly with the boy, thought she could help. She was gone in 3 days. Sandra swallowed hard. "I'm just here to work, ma'am." Mrs. Chen studied her for a long moment, eyes narrowing like she was reading something written on Sandra's soul. Then she nodded. "Good. Follow me." As they walked through the mansion, Sandra kept her eyes mostly down, but she couldn't help noticing things. The silence, so thick, it felt like walking through water. The way other staff members moved without speaking, without looking at each other. The heavy weight pressing down on every room like grief had soaked into the walls and refused to leave. And then she saw him, a small boy sitting on the marble staircase, arranging colored blocks in a perfect line. He didn't look up when they passed, didn't acknowledge anyone. His shoulders were hunched, his movements slow and careful. But what caught Sandra's attention was something else, something small, the way his hand drifted to his throat, just for a second, touching it lightly before pulling away, and the tiny wince that crossed his face when he did. Sandra's chest tightened. She'd seen that gesture before. Years ago, watching her younger cousin in Trenton who'd lost his voice for months until they finally found what was blocking his airway. But she didn't say anything, just kept walking, kept her head down like Mrs. Chen told her to. Still, her heart whispered something she couldn't ignore. Pay attention to this child. Days passed. Sandra cleaned floors, wiped windows, dusted shelves that probably cost more than her father's yearly medical bills. She kept to herself like she'd been told. But she couldn't stop watching Brian. Every morning, the same routine. The boy would sit alone in the sunroom surrounded by model airplanes and puzzle pieces. His world was small, controlled, safe. No one bothered him there. The other staff avoided him, not out of cruelty but out of something that felt like fear. Like his silence was contagious. Like if they got too close, they might catch whatever curse had taken his voice. Some of them whispered, when they thought no one was listening. Whispered that the boy was cursed, that his mother's death had stolen his voice along with her last breath. Superstition, that's all it was. But Sandra saw something different. She saw a child who was desperately, achingly lonely. And if you're still watching right now, feeling that weight in your chest, this channel is made for people like you. Subscribing isn't about videos. It's about choosing not to look away when stories like this matter. A boy who sat by tall windows and pressed his small hand against the glass, watching the gardeners outside, watching birds fly past, watching a world that moved and laughed and made noise while he stayed trapped in silence. She saw the way he'd look at his father when Thomas walked past the sunroom without stopping, the way Brian's shoulders would sink just a little lower, the way hope would flicker in his eyes and then die. And she saw how he touched his throat, over and over, wincing slightly each time. No one else seemed to notice. Or maybe they'd stopped noticing years ago. One afternoon, Sandra was dusting the hallway near the sunroom when she saw Brian struggling with a model airplane wing. His small fingers couldn't get the piece to snap into place. Frustration creased his young face. She knew she shouldn't interfere. Mrs. Chen's warning echoed in her mind like a siren, but before she could stop herself, Sandra knelt down beside him and gently took the wing from his hands. She fitted it into place with a soft click. Brian looked up at her. For a long moment, they just stared at each other. His eyes were asking a question she couldn't quite read. Then something happened. The tiniest smile flickered at the corner of his mouth, barely there but real. Sandra's heart cracked wide open. She smiled back and gave him a small wave. His hand lifted slowly, carefully, and he waved in return. That night, Sandra lay in her narrow bed in the staff quarters staring at the ceiling. She couldn't stop thinking about that wave. Such a small gesture, but it felt like everything. The next morning, she left something on the staircase where Brian always sat. A folded paper crane, simple, made from yellow paper she'd found in the kitchen. She didn't wait to see if he'd take it. But the following day, the crane was gone. In its place, a note written in shaky letters. "Thank you." Sandra pressed that note to her chest and closed her eyes. She whispered into the empty room, "Lord, please let me help this child. Show me what no one else can see." She didn't know it yet, but God was already answering, and the answer would cost her everything she had. Brian's mornings always started the same way. Speech therapist at 8, tutor at 10, occupational therapy at noon. His father had built an entire schedule around fixing what the doctors said couldn't be fixed. The therapists came with briefcases full of flashcards and mirrors and exercises that never worked. They'd sit across from Brian in the sunroom, speaking slowly, exaggerating every syllable like volume could somehow unlock his voice. Say, Brian, just try. Open your mouth and push the sound out. We know you can do it." But Brian couldn't. His lips would move. His throat would tighten with effort. Nothing came. The therapists would write notes in their leather folders, the same notes every week. No progress. Patient remains non-verbal. Recommend continued intervention. Thomas paid them anyway. $1,500 an hour for people to tell him his son was still silent. There were machines too, expensive ones, shipped from Switzerland and Japan. Voice amplifiers, vibration devices, neurological stimulators with electrodes that stuck to Brian's neck like cold fingers. None of them made a difference. The boy stayed quiet, but Sandra noticed something the doctors didn't. One afternoon, she was cleaning the grand piano in the parlor when her hand accidentally brushed the keys. A sharp note rang out through the empty room. Brian's head snapped up from where he sat 20 feet away. His eyes went wide, alert, focused. Sandra played another note, then another. Each time, Brian turned toward the sound like a flower following the sun. He could hear. That much was obvious. So why did everyone act like he couldn't? Sandra tested it again the next day. She dropped a book in the hallway. Brian flinched. She closed a door a little too hard. His shoulders jumped. Footsteps on the marble floor. The clink of silverware in the kitchen. The wind rattling the windows. He heard all of it. But when people spoke to him, when they called his name or asked him questions, nothing. No reaction. Like their voices didn't exist. It didn't make sense. Sandra had never heard of muteness that worked like that. You either heard sound or you didn't. But Brian seemed to exist in some strange in-between place, where the world was loud but words were silent. The tutors didn't seem to notice. Or maybe they'd stopped caring. They'd show up, teach their lessons to a boy who couldn't answer, collect their checks and leave. Thomas barely came into the room anymore. He'd stand in the doorway sometimes, watching his son work through math problems or trace letters in a workbook. But he never stayed long. The weight of disappointment was too heavy. Sandra saw other things too, small things that made her stomach twist. The way Brian would grab his throat suddenly, like something hurt. The way his breath would hitch mid-inhale, catching on something invisible. She mentioned it once to Mrs. Palmer, the head tutor, a sharp woman from Boston with silver hair and no patience. "The boy does that when he's anxious," Mrs. Palmer said, without looking up from her paperwork. "All the specialists have noted it. It's behavioral, psychosomatic. He's traumatized by his condition." Sandra wanted to argue, but she kept quiet. She wasn't a doctor. She wasn't anyone important. Just a maid trying to keep her father alive. But the choking, that was different. It happened during a breathing exercise on a Tuesday afternoon. The respiratory therapist, a young man named Colin with kind eyes and steady hands, was guiding Brian through deep inhales. "Breathe in slowly. Hold it. Now let it out." Brian tried. His small chest expanded. Then suddenly his face twisted. His hand flew to his throat. His mouth opened, but no air came. He was choking, gasping. Panic flooded his eyes. Colin jumped forward, slapping Brian's back, tilting his head. "Breathe, Brian. You're okay. Just breathe." Mrs. Palmer rushed over. Thomas appeared in the doorway, face white. For 10 terrible seconds, The room was chaos. Then Brian coughed once, hard, and air rushed back into his lungs. His face returned to its normal color. The panic faded. Everyone exhaled. Colin checked his airway with a small light. Nothing there. Must have been a spasm. Laryngeal tension. Happens sometimes with stress. Thomas nodded slowly, his hand still shaking. He looked at his son for a long moment, then turned and walked away without a word. Mrs. Palmer gathered her things. The session is over for today. Colin packed up his equipment. Sandra stood in the corner, watching Brian sit alone on the floor, one hand still pressed against his throat. Something was wrong. She knew it in her bones, but nobody else seemed to care enough to look. Sandra Wallace had the kind of hands that told stories. Rough palms, calloused fingers, nails cut short, because there was no time for anything pretty. Hands that had scrubbed floors in diners, changed bedpans in nursing homes, held her father's trembling grip during dialysis sessions at St. Michael's Medical Center. She was 42 years old but looked older. Life had a way of aging people who carried too much weight on their shoulders. Newark had been home her whole life. The apartment on South Orange Avenue where she grew up, the church on Springfield where she still sang in the choir every Sunday, the hospital where her father now spent 3 days a week, hooked to a machine that kept his blood clean. 4 months behind on bills. That's what the notice said. The one that came in the plain white envelope with the hospital logo in the corner. If payment isn't received within 30 days, treatment will be transferred to a state facility. Sandra knew what that meant. It meant her father would die in a room with peeling paint and nurses who didn't have time to learn his name. It meant giving up. And Sandra Wallace didn't know how to give up. So when the agency called about a live-in position at a mansion in Westport, she took it. Didn't matter that it was an hour away. Didn't matter that she'd be sleeping in a stranger's house. The pay was enough to keep her father alive. That was all that mattered. Mrs. Brennan, the head housekeeper, met her at the servants' entrance on her first day. A tall woman with steel-grey hair pulled back so tight it looked painful. You'll work the east wing, main hall, and library. You'll keep to yourself. Mr. Jackson values his privacy, especially regarding his son. Sandra nodded. Understood. The tour was brief. Room after room of marble and mahogany, and furniture that probably cost more than Sandra would earn in 10 years. But what struck her wasn't the wealth. It was the silence. Not peaceful, suffocating, like the house itself was holding its breath. The other staff members moved like ghosts. A young woman named Lily dusted a bookshelf without making a sound. An older man, Warren, polished silver in the dining room with his eyes down. Nobody spoke. Nobody looked at each other. It felt wrong. Then Sandra saw the boy. He was sitting in the sunroom, cross-legged on an expensive rug, building something with wooden blocks. 7 years old, maybe 8, small for his age. Dark hair that needed cutting. He didn't look up when they passed, but Sandra felt his eyes on her after they walked by. She turned back. He was watching her now, not with fear. Not with curiosity exactly. Something else. Something that looked like hope. Their eyes met for just a second before Mrs. Brennan cleared her throat. That's Brian, Mr. Jackson's son. He doesn't speak. Don't try to engage with him. The last girl who did was let go. Sandra looked back one more time. The boy had returned to his blocks, but his hand drifted to his throat, fingers pressing lightly against the skin. Then he pulled them away quickly, like the touch hurt. Sandra's chest tightened. She'd seen that gesture before. Years ago in Trenton, when her cousin Darnell was 9 years old, he'd lost his voice suddenly, completely. For 6 months, doctors ran tests and found nothing. Said it was psychological, trauma, stress. Then one day, Darnell's aunt took him to a different doctor who actually looked down his throat with the right equipment. Found a growth, small, hidden, blocking his vocal cords. 2 hours of surgery and Darnell was talking again. But those 6 months, everyone had missed it. Everyone had been looking in the wrong places. That night, Sandra lay in her narrow bed in the staff quarters, staring at the ceiling. She couldn't stop thinking about Brian's hand on his throat, the way his breath seemed to catch, the way he'd looked at her like he was drowning and she was the only one who noticed. She closed her eyes and whispered into the darkness, "Lord, I don't know what I'm doing here. I don't know why you put this child in my path. But something is wrong, something they all missed. Please, if you're listening, show me what they can't see." The room stayed silent, but somewhere deep in her spirit, Sandra felt an answer. Not in words, just a knowing, a certainty that settled in her bones. She was here for a reason, and that reason was sleeping down the hall in a room full of expensive toys and suffocating loneliness. Sandra watched Brian the way a mother watches a sick child, quietly, carefully, without making it obvious. She'd learned over the years that people revealed things when they thought no one was paying attention, so she paid attention. She noticed everything. The way Brian would take shallow breaths most of the day, like deep ones hurt. The way panic would flash across his face sometimes, for no reason anyone else could see. The way his hand would fly to his throat and press hard, then release, then press again. But she also noticed what wasn't there. No tremors, no delayed responses, no confusion or difficulty understanding. When Mrs. Brennan gave instructions to the staff, Brian would glance up and his eyes would track the conversation perfectly. He understood every word. His mind was sharp, alert, completely intact. That wasn't neurological muteness. Sandra had worked in enough care facilities to know what brain damage looked like. This wasn't it. So she started testing, quietly, indirectly, in ways no one would notice. One afternoon, while cleaning the music room, she sat at the piano and played a simple melody. Brian was in the hallway arranging his blocks. She watched from the corner of her eye. His head tilted, his fingers stopped moving. He was listening. She played a low note, then a high one. Each time, he responded, turned his head, shifted his body toward the sound. She pressed her hand flat against the piano wood and hummed, letting the vibration travel through the instrument. Brian stood up and walked closer, put his small hand on the doorframe, felt the vibration, smiled. He could hear. He could feel. He could understand. So why couldn't he speak? Sandra's mind went back to Trenton, to her cousin Darnell and those terrible 6 months when everyone thought he'd lost his voice from trauma. His grandmother swore it was grief over his mother leaving. The school counselor said it was selective mutism. The first 3 doctors said it was psychological. But Darnell's aunt, Rhonda, didn't believe them. She took him to a throat specialist in Newark who used a scope, a tiny camera that went down into places the other doctors never looked. And there it was, a small benign growth pressing against his vocal cords. Not cancer, not dangerous, but blocking everything. 2 hours of outpatient surgery, and Darnell was talking again, laughing again, living again. What if Brian had the same thing? What if something was blocking his airway and everyone was so focused on his brain that they never looked at his throat? Sandra's hands trembled as she dusted the bookshelves. She wanted to say something, wanted to march into Thomas Jackson's study and tell him to get his son a proper throat examination. But who was she? A maid from Newark, with a high school diploma and medical bills she couldn't pay. Mrs. Brennan had already warned her. The last girl who tried to help was let go. Sandra couldn't lose this job. Her father needed her, but this child needed someone too. This is the point where most people say, "I'll subscribe later." Later never comes. If you'd regret missing what's about to happen, subscribe now, because the people who don't always end up back here wishing they had. She was still wrestling with the decision 3 days later when it happened. Brian was walking down the main hallway, heading toward the sunroom like he did every morning. Sandra was cleaning the marble floor 20 feet away. Suddenly, Brian stopped. His hand shot to his throat. His face went pale. He tried to inhale, but nothing came. His knees buckled and he dropped to the floor, gasping, choking, his small body convulsing. Sandra threw down her cleaning cloth and ran. "Brian, breathe, baby. Just breathe." She tilted his head back, checked his airway the way she'd learned in the CPR class the nursing home made her take. He was getting some air, but not enough. His lips were turning blue. Warren, the butler, came running. So did Mrs. Brennan. "What happened?" "I don't know," Sandra said. "He just collapsed." Warren pulled out his phone. "Should I call an ambulance?" Before anyone could answer, Brian coughed once, hard, and air rushed back into his lungs. His color returned. His breathing steadied. He sat up slowly, dazed, scared. "Mrs." Brennan helped him to his feet. "He's fine. It was just a panic attack. The doctors said he has them sometimes." Warren put his phone away. Sandra stared at them both. That wasn't a panic attack. That was choking. Mrs. Brennan's eyes went cold. "I suggest you return to your duties, Sandra. We know how to care for this child." Sandra stepped back, watched as they led Brian away, his small hand still pressed against his throat. Nobody else seemed afraid. Nobody else seemed to care. But Sandra's fear had turned into something else now. Certainty. Something was blocking that boy's airway. And if she didn't do something soon, he was going to die in this silent house while everyone looked the other way. Thomas Jackson left for Seattle on a Thursday morning. "Big merger," Mrs. Brennan said. "He'll be gone 3 days." The mansion felt even emptier than usual. Half the staff had the weekend off. Just Sandra, Mrs. Brennan, Warren, and Lily remained. The house stretched out around them like a tomb. Brian spent most of the day in his room. Sandra checked on him twice while cleaning the hallway. He was sitting by the window both times, staring out at nothing, one hand resting against his throat. She wanted to say something, wanted to ask if he was okay, but Mrs. Brennan's warning still echoed in her head. "Don't engage with the boy." That night, Sandra couldn't sleep. Something felt wrong. The air in the mansion was too thick, too heavy. She lay in her narrow bed staring at the ceiling, praying without words. Then she heard it, a thud, muffled, coming from upstairs. She sat up, listened. Nothing. Maybe she'd imagined it. Then another sound, desperate, frantic, footsteps running. Sandra threw off her blanket and ran into the hallway. The main staircase was empty. The lights were dim. Lily appeared at the top of the stairs, her face white. "Sandra, come quick. It's Brian." Sandra took the stairs 2 at a time. Brian's bedroom door was open. He was on the floor, convulsing. His face was purple. His hands clawed at his throat. No air was getting through. None. This wasn't a panic attack. This wasn't anxiety. This was full obstruction. Warren was on his phone, yelling at the 911 operator. "We need an ambulance now. Mansion on Coastal Drive. Hurry." Mrs. Brennan was frozen in the doorway, hands over her mouth. Lily was crying. Sandra dropped to her knees beside Brian. She tilted his head back, opened his mouth, tried to see down his throat. Too dark, too narrow. She couldn't see anything. The Heimlich maneuver. She positioned herself behind him, wrapped her arms around his small chest, pulled upward hard. Once, twice, 3 times, nothing. His body went limp. His eyes rolled back. No, not like this. Sandra's mind raced. She thought of Darnell, thought of the doctor who'd finally found what everyone else missed, thought of the growth blocking his airway. What if it wasn't deep inside? What if it was close? What if she could reach it? Warren was still on the phone. Ambulance is 10 minutes out. 10 minutes was too long. Brian would be dead in 3. Sandra looked at Lily. "Get me a flashlight and rubbing alcohol. Now." Lily ran. Mrs. Brennan finally moved. "What are you doing? Saving his life. You can't just—" "I can, and I will. Fire me later." Lily returned with a small flashlight and a bottle of isopropyl alcohol. Sandra poured the alcohol over her hands, rubbed them together, grabbed the flashlight. She tilted Brian's head back as far as it would go, opened his mouth, shined the light down his throat. There. Something dark, something that shouldn't be there, rubbery, lodged against the back of his throat, blocking everything. Sandra didn't think, didn't hesitate. Thinking would make her stop, and stopping would kill this child. She slid 2 fingers into Brian's mouth, reached back, felt the mass. It was solid, dense, slippery. She hooked her fingers around it, pulled. It didn't move. She adjusted her grip, pulled harder. It shifted. Brian's body jerked. She kept pulling, slowly, carefully. The mass started to come free, inch by inch. It was longer than she'd expected, thicker. Warren stopped talking into the phone. Mrs. Brennan gasped. Sandra pulled one more time and the entire thing came out. Dark, rubbery, almost 3 inches long, covered in mucus and tissue. It landed on the floor beside them. For one terrible second, nothing happened. Brian lay still. His chest didn't move. His eyes didn't open. Then air, a huge gasping inhale, violent, desperate. Life flooding back into his lungs. His chest heaved. His eyes flew open. He coughed, gagged, gasped again. Color returned to his face, pink, spreading across his cheeks. He was breathing, crying, alive. Sandra pulled him into her arms. "You're okay, baby. You're okay now." She rocked him back and forth, tears streaming down her face. Warren stared at the mass on the floor. "What is that?" Mrs. Brennan covered her mouth. "Oh my God." Lily was crying harder now. Sirens wailed in the distance, but Sandra didn't hear them. She was holding Brian, feeling his heartbeat against her chest, feeling his breath against her shoulder. That's all that mattered. He was alive, and whatever had stolen his voice for 7 years was lying on the floor like a dead thing that should have been removed a lifetime ago. Brian sat on the floor, Sandra's arms still wrapped around him. His chest rose and fell in steady rhythm, air moving freely through passages that had been blocked for 7 years. He touched his throat gently, experimentally, like he was testing whether it still hurt. It didn't. For the first time in his life, breathing didn't feel like drowning. The paramedics arrived 3 minutes later. 2 men in Navy uniforms carrying equipment that suddenly seemed unnecessary. Warren met them at the door. The boy is breathing now. One of them, a tall man named Kirk with kind eyes, knelt beside Brian. "Hey, buddy, I'm going to check you out, okay?" He pulled out a small light and examined Brian's throat. The tissue was red, irritated, but the airway was clear, completely clear. Kirk looked at the mass on the floor. "What is that?" "Some kind of polyp," Sandra said quietly. "It was blocking his throat." Kirk picked it up carefully with gloved hands, placed it in a specimen bag. "The hospital is going to want to examine this." He looked at Sandra. "You removed this?" "Yes, sir." He shook his head slowly. "You saved his life. If that had stayed in there another few minutes, we'd be doing CPR right now." Mrs. Brennan stood in the corner, pale and silent. Lily had stopped crying, but her hands still shook. Warren stared at Brian like he was seeing a ghost. Kirk checked Brian's vitals. Heart rate elevated but stable. Oxygen levels good. "You're one lucky kid." He turned to Mrs. Brennan. "We need to take him to the hospital. Full examination. Make sure there's no damage." Mrs. Brennan nodded. "Of course. I'll call Mr. Jackson." But before anyone could move, something happened. Brian's mouth opened. His throat worked. Muscles that had never functioned properly suddenly remembered what they were made for. A sound came out. Small, rough, broken, but real. "Duh." Everyone froze. Brian's eyes went wide. He touched his throat again. Tried again. "Dad." The word was clearer this time. Stronger. Sandra's hand flew to her mouth. "Oh my God." Brian looked at her, then at the others, then back at his own hands like they belonged to someone else. His face crumpled. 7 years of silence broke open all at once. He cried. Not the silent tears he'd cried before. Real crying. Loud. Messy. The kind of crying that comes from somewhere deep and won't be held back. Wailing that echoed through the mansion like a storm. The sound filled every room, every hallway, every corner that had been silent for so long. Lily started crying again. Warren turned away and wiped his eyes. "Missus." Brennan just stood there, hand over her heart. Sandra pulled Brian close again. "Let it out, baby. Let it all out." He sobbed against her shoulder, his small body shaking. She rocked him gently, whispering prayers of thanks. The mansion had never heard noise like this. For 7 years it had been a tomb. Now it was alive, breathing, crying, human. Kirk radioed his partner. "We need to transport now." But even as he said it, the front door burst open. Footsteps pounded across the marble floor. Fast, desperate. Thomas Jackson appeared in the doorway. His suit jacket was gone. His tie hung loose. His face was wild with panic. Mrs. Brennan had called him from the ambulance dispatch, told him his son had collapsed. He'd left the Seattle meeting without a word, drove straight to the airport, chartered a private jet, broke every speed limit from the airstrip to the mansion. He stood frozen in the doorway now, eyes locked on his son, on Sandra holding him, on the paramedics, on the mass in the specimen bag. What happened? His voice was barely a whisper. Brian lifted his head from Sandra's shoulder, looked at his father. Their eyes met. 7 years of distance, 7 years of grief and guilt and unanswered questions. Then Brian spoke. One word that changed everything. "Dad." If that word just hit you the way it hit everyone in that room, and you still choose not to subscribe, I genuinely want to know why. Tell me in the comments what stopped you. Thomas's knees buckled. He grabbed the door frame to keep from falling. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. His son, his silent son, the boy who had never made a sound, was speaking. Brian said it again, louder this time, stronger. Dad. Thomas moved forward like a man in a dream, dropped to his knees in front of his son, reached out with shaking hands. Brian's lip trembled. He reached back. Daddy. Thomas pulled him close, held him like he'd wanted to hold him for 7 years but never knew how. The sound of his son's voice broke something inside him, something that had been frozen since the day Loretta died. He buried his face in Brian's hair and wept, great heaving sobs that shook his whole body. Brian held on tight, still crying, still saying the word over and over like he was making up for lost time. Daddy, Daddy, I'm here. Sandra stood up slowly, backed away, gave them space. Her job was done. Kirk watched with wet eyes. His partner stood silent. Even Mrs. Brennan was crying now. The mansion that had been silent for 7 years was filled with sound, crying, breathing, speaking, living. And in that moment, everything broken started to heal. Thomas held his son for what felt like hours but was only seconds. His mind was catching up to what his heart already knew. Brian was speaking. After 7 years of silence, his son had a voice. But then Thomas saw the blood, small drops on Brian's chin, smeared on Sandra's fingers. He pulled back, looked at his son's face more closely. Brian's lips were red. His throat was irritated. There were marks. Thomas's eyes moved to Sandra, to her hands, to the specimen bag on the floor with that dark rubbery mass inside. What did you do? His voice was low. Dangerous. Sandra stepped back. Mr. Jackson, he was choking. I had to. What did you do to my son? The room shifted. The miracle turned into something else, something that looked like assault. Thomas saw his crying child, saw blood, saw a maid he barely knew standing over him, the paramedics, the chaos. His mind couldn't process it fast enough. All he knew was his son was hurt, and someone had hurt him. Get away from him. Thomas stood up, putting himself between Sandra and Brian. Mr. Jackson, please listen. She was choking. I saved his life. You put your hands inside his throat. Kirk, the paramedic, stepped forward. Sir, she removed an obstruction. Your son couldn't breathe. If she hadn't acted, he would have died before we got here. Thomas wasn't hearing him. Wasn't hearing anything, except the roar of panic in his own head. He pulled out his phone, called the head of his security team. Get to the house now. Then he dialed 911. I need police at my residence immediately. Someone assaulted my son. Sandra's legs went weak. Mr. Jackson, no. Please, you don't understand. Warren moved toward her. Sandra, maybe you should wait outside. I didn't hurt him. I helped him. Mrs. Brennan's face was torn between fear and confusion. She'd seen what happened, seen Sandra save Brian's life. But she also saw Thomas Jackson's rage and knew better than to stand against it. 2 security guards arrived within minutes. Broad-shouldered men in black suits named Hayes and Pruitt. Mr. Jackson pointed at Sandra. Restrain her until the police arrive. Hayes hesitated. Sir, the paramedics said she. I don't care what they said. She put her hands on my son. Restrain her. Now. Pruitt moved first, grabbed Sandra's arm. She didn't resist, didn't fight. Just looked at Brian with tears streaming down her face. I'm sorry, baby. I'm so sorry. Brian's eyes went wide. He tried to stand, but his legs were still shaky. He looked at his father, at the guards holding Sandra, at the fear on her face, and something inside him understood. They thought she hurt him. No. His voice was rough, unpracticed, but clear. Stop. Everyone froze. Brian said it louder. No. Stop. She helped me. She saved me. Thomas turned to his son. Brian, it's okay. You're safe now. I'm not letting Dad. The word caught in his throat. He coughed. Tried again. Don't hurt her. Please. But Thomas was too far gone. Too deep in his own panic. Too used to 7 years of silence to really hear what his son was saying. Brian, be quiet. We'll talk about this later. The old command. The old habit. Silencing his son because silence was all he'd ever known. Brian's face crumpled. Police sirens wailed outside. 2 officers came through the door. Westport PD. "We got a call about an assault." Thomas pointed at Sandra. "This woman put her hands on my son without permission, caused him physical harm." Officer Valdez, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes, looked at Sandra, then at Brian, then at the paramedics. "What happened here?" Kirk spoke up. The boy was choking. Full airway obstruction. She removed a mass from his throat. Saved his life. We were 3 minutes out. He wouldn't have made it. Officer Valdez looked at Thomas. "So she performed emergency first aid. That's not assault, Mr. Jackson." Thomas's jaw tightened. She had no medical training, no authority. "My son is bleeding." Valdez examined Brian quickly. Minor irritation, consistent with obstruction removal. She looked at the specimen bag. "What is that?" Kirk handed it to her. "Polyp or growth. Was blocking the child's airway. Probably been there for years." Valdez processed this slowly. "Your son couldn't speak before tonight." Thomas nodded stiffly. "And now he can." "Yes." "Because she removed the obstruction." Thomas said nothing. Officer Reyes, Valdez's partner, pulled out handcuffs. Standard procedure in assault calls. "We need to take her in for questioning until we sort this out." Sandra closed her eyes. Brian screamed, "No, don't take her. Please, Daddy, please. Don't let them take her." But Thomas turned away. Couldn't look at his son. Couldn't look at Sandra. The cuffs clicked around Sandra's wrists, cold metal against warm skin. She didn't fight, just whispered one more prayer. "Lord, let him understand. Let them all understand." Valdez led her toward the door. Brian tried to follow, but Mrs. Brennan held him back. Sandra, come back." His voice broke. The first voice he'd ever had was crying out for the woman who gave it to him. Sandra looked back one last time, saw Brian reaching for her, saw Thomas standing frozen, saw the mansion she'd walked into hoping to save her father. She'd saved a child instead, and now she was leaving in handcuffs. The door closed behind her. Brian's screams echoed through the mansion. The sound Thomas had waited 7 years to hear, and it was breaking both their hearts. Yale New Haven Hospital was cold and bright. Too bright. The kind of lighting that made everything look clinical and harsh. Thomas sat in a waiting room chair while doctors examined Brian in another room. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. Kirk had insisted they bring Brian in for a full workup. Make sure there's no damage. Make sure everything is clear. Thomas had agreed numbly. The adrenaline was wearing off now. His mind was starting to work again. Starting to ask questions he should have asked an hour ago. Why had that mass been in his son's throat? How long had it been there? And why hadn't any doctor found it in 7 years? Dr. Vance appeared 40 minutes later. She was in her 50s, grey hair pulled back, eyes that had seen too much to be surprised by anything. But she looked surprised now. "Mr. Jackson, I need to speak with you. Is he okay? Your son is fine." "Better than fine, actually. His vocal cords are intact. There's some irritation from the removal, but nothing permanent." "He's talking." Thomas nodded. "I heard him." Dr. Vance sat down across from him. "We ran a full scan, CT and MRI. What we found is troubling." She pulled out a tablet, showed him images of Brian's throat. "This is what it looks like now. Clear airway, healthy tissue. And this," she swiped to another image, "is what we believe it looked like before." The screen showed a large, dark mass pressing against the vocal cords, nearly blocking the entire passage. Thomas stared at the image. "What is that?" "A benign polyp, likely congenital. It's been growing since birth." Dr. Vance leaned forward. "Mr. Jackson, a mass this size doesn't develop overnight. This has been there for years." "I know. It was just removed tonight." She shook her head. "That's not what I mean. A mass this size would have been visible on scans. Any ENT specialist with the right equipment would have found it." Thomas felt ice forming in his chest. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying your son should have been diagnosed years ago." She paused. "Do you have his medical records? Everything from his previous examinations?" Thomas pulled out his phone, called his lawyer. "Get me every medical file on Brian. Every report. Every scan. I want them sent to Yale New Haven immediately." The files arrived within an hour. Dr. Vance reviewed them with 2 colleagues, an ENT specialist named Dr. Kowalski and a radiologist named Dr. Patel. Thomas sat in the consultation room, watching their faces change as they read. Dr. Kowalski looked up first. When was this taken? He pointed to a scan from 4 years ago. Boston Children's Hospital. Thomas recognized the date. Dr. Kowalski turned his screen around. There. You see that shadow? That's the polyp. It was visible 4 years ago. Doctor. Patel pulled up another file. Here too. This one's from Mayo Clinic. 3 years ago. Same shadow. Same location. Thomas couldn't breathe. Why didn't they tell me? Dr. Vance's face was grim. Did any of these doctors recommend a laryngoscopy? A scope to examine the throat directly? Thomas tried to remember. They said it wasn't necessary. Said his condition was neurological. That surgery wouldn't help. Dr. Kowalski made a sound of disgust. Neurological muteness doesn't show shadows on a CT scan. This is medical negligence. Or worse. What do you mean worse? Dr. Vance exchanged a look with her colleagues. Mr. Jackson, how much did you spend on therapy for your son? Millions. Speech therapy, occupational therapy, neurological consultations. It never stopped. And those doctors, were they affiliated with the same medical groups, the same hospital networks? Thomas pulled up his records, started tracing names. Dr. Raymond Fisk at Boston Children's, Dr. Patricia Holbrook at Mayo, Dr. Stuart Brennan at UCLA. All of them referred by doctor. Eugene Cartwright, Brian's primary neurologist. All of them part of Cartwright's network. Thomas's stomach turned. They knew. Dr. Vance spoke carefully. I can't prove intent, but I can tell you that a child with permanent neurological muteness requires ongoing expensive treatment. A child with a removable polyp requires one surgery. Thomas stood up, walked to the window, looked out at the city lights blurring through his tears. They lied. They saw the mass, and they lied. They let my son suffer for 7 years so they could keep billing me. Dr. Kowalski put a hand on his shoulder. We'll report this to the medical board. There will be investigations, lawsuits. Thomas wasn't hearing him. He was thinking about Brian, about 7 years of silence, 7 years of loneliness, 7 years of a child who couldn't call for his mother, couldn't tell his father he was scared, couldn't say he was in pain. And Thomas had paid for it. Written checks that funded their lie, trusted them, believed them when they said there was no hope. He'd silenced his own son by trusting the people who were supposed to heal him. The guilt crashed over him like a wave. He sank into a chair and buried his face in his hands. 7 years. Dr. Vance knelt beside him. Your son is talking now. That's what matters. But Thomas couldn't stop seeing Sandra's face. The way she'd looked at him when the police put her in handcuffs. The way Brian had screamed for her. She saved him, Thomas whispered. And I had her arrested. Dr. Vance said nothing. There was nothing to say. Thomas Jackson had spent $100 million on doctors who lied to him. And the person who finally told the truth was sitting in a jail cell because he'd been too blind, too panicked, too broken to see it. He'd paid for his son's silence. And when someone finally broke it, he'd punished her for the miracle. The weight of that realization was crushing, but it was nothing compared to what he had to do next. He had to make it right. The Westport Police Department holding area smelled like stale coffee and disinfectant. Sandra sat on a metal bench, hands folded in her lap, eyes closed. She wasn't praying anymore. She'd already said everything she needed to say to God. Now she was just waiting to see what happened next, waiting to find out if saving a child's life would cost her everything. The door opened. Officer Valdez appeared. You have a visitor. Sandra looked up. Expected a public defender, maybe. Someone from the agency that placed her at the mansion. But it was Thomas Jackson who walked through the door. He looked broken, suit wrinkled, tie gone, eyes red from crying. He stood there for a long moment, just staring at her. Then he dropped to his knees, right there on the concrete floor in front of everyone. Mr. Jackson. His voice came out raw. I'm sorry. Sandra's breath caught. I was wrong. You saved my son's life and I. He couldn't finish. The words got stuck somewhere between his throat and his heart. Sandra leaned forward. Mr. Jackson, please get up. He shook his head. Not until you hear me. The doctors, they lied. For 7 years they saw what was wrong and they lied. They let him suffer so they could keep billing me. And you saw what they missed. You did what $100 million couldn't do. You gave my son his voice. Tears ran down his face. And I had you arrested for it. Sandra reached out slowly, placed her hand on his shoulder. You were scared. You saw blood and you panicked. Any father would have done the same. That's not true. A good father would have listened, would have trusted, would have seen that you were the answer to 7 years of prayers. Thomas looked up at her. How can you forgive me? Because forgiveness isn't about what you deserve. It's about what God asks us to give. And besides, she smiled softly, your son got his voice back. That's all that matters. Thomas stood up slowly. Valdez was already processing the paperwork. All charges dropped. Full apology from the department. Thomas's lawyers had moved fast. Sandra was free to go. But Thomas wasn't done. He pulled out an envelope. Your father's medical bills. All of them. Paid in full, including the next 5 years of dialysis. Sandra's hand flew to her mouth. Mr. Jackson, I can't. Yes, you can. It's not charity. It's not even gratitude. It's justice. You saved my son. Let me save your father. Sandra took the envelope with shaking hands. She couldn't speak, could only nod. Thomas continued, there's more. A trust fund in your name. Enough to make sure you never have to choose between your family and your calling again. And if you'll accept it, a position at the house, not as a maid, as Brian's companion, his friend, the person he trusts most in the world. Sandra wiped her eyes. I'd be honored. They drove back to the mansion together as the sun was rising. The iron gates opened slowly, but something was different. The house didn't feel like a tomb anymore. Music was playing, not loud, just soft piano notes drifting through the open windows. Warren had turned on the sound system for the first time in 7 years. The front door stood wide open. Lily was singing in the kitchen. Mrs. Brennan was laughing at something on the phone. And in the sunroom, Brian sat at a small table, talking, actually talking, telling Kirk about his model airplanes. His voice was rough, unpracticed, stumbling over words he'd never said out loud before. But it was beautiful. He looked up when Sandra walked in. Sandra. He jumped up, ran to her, threw his arms around her waist. You came back. Of course I came back. I promised I'd help you, didn't I? Brian pulled back, looked up at her with those bright eyes. You did more than help me. You saved me. Sandra knelt down to his level. No, baby. God saved you. I was just the hands he used. Brian thought about that for a moment. Then he smiled. That's a really nice way to say it. Can I ask you something? Anything. Will you teach me more words? I have so many things I want to say, and I don't know how to say them all yet. Sandra laughed. A real laugh that filled the room. We have all the time in the world. Over the next weeks, the mansion transformed. Thomas fired Dr. Cartwright and his entire network, filed lawsuits that would make headlines, testified before medical boards. But more than that, he opened his home. The windows stayed open. Music played every day. Brian's laughter echoed through hallways that had been silent for too long. He asked 1,000 questions, about everything. About birds and airplanes and why the sky was blue and what his mother had been like. Thomas answered every single one. Sometimes through tears, but always with honesty. Brian's voice grew stronger. He started singing, started telling jokes, started living the childhood he should have had all along. And Sandra stayed, not as an employee but as family. She brought her father to live in the guest house once he was stable enough. Every Sunday, they all went to church together. Thomas Jackson, the billionaire who thought money could solve everything, sitting in a pew beside Sandra Wallace, the woman who taught him that some miracles only come through faith and the courage to act. The doctors were investigated, licenses revoked. Cartwright went to prison. Justice was slow, but it came. And through it all, the Jackson mansion sang, doors opening and closing, voices calling to each other, laughter bouncing off marble floors, life where death had lived for too long. The house that once swallowed sound now sang with it. And in that song was proof that wealth could be humbled, faith could be rewarded, a child could be reclaimed, and a maid could be revealed as the hero she'd always been. This channel tells stories about moments the world almost ignored. Subscribing tells me you're not someone who ignores them. And if you're not subscribing, don't scroll away quietly. Go to the comments and tell us why this story wasn't worth staying connected to.